Could our sun, the thing that makes so much of life possible, also be the thing that kills us? The sun is highly active, with massive currents of plasma and solar material moving around and interacting with giant, warping magnetic fields. This activity can sometimes lead to explosive results, with things called solar flares bursting from the surface and giant explosions called coronal mass ejections being spewed and launched into space. Both of these explosive events can actually reach Earth and have effects on us, but normally the consequences of it aren't really that bad. But the perfect storm of solar activity, a mega solar storm, could be one of the biggest threats to human existence that there is. And what might surprise you is that some solar storms that could be classed as these perfect solar storms have actually almost caused catastrophe for us in the recent past. But more on that in a little bit. Now, solar flares are massive bursts of energy on the surface of the sun that emit massive amounts of light rays, including UV rays and X-rays. And the explosive nature of the event can cause energetic particles to be sent outward away from the sun. Now, coronal mass ejections, on the other hand, are, well, they're huge. They can have the power of 10 billion atomic bombs. They're massive explosions that send billions of tons of particles, along with magnetic field, out from the solar corona into space. If the solar events are in the direction of Earth, the light rays from solar flares can reach the planet in just 8 minutes, followed closely behind by energetic particles. Whereas coronal mass ejections can reach us within 24 hours, but can take up to a few days. Now, once here, both can interact with Earth's magnetic field and atmospheric particles, and through these interactions, they actually both contribute to northern and southern lights. But they also both bring specific threats. A solar flare's X-rays, UV rays, and energetic particles that follow can interact with particles in our atmosphere and cause disruption to radio signals, which can lead to radio blackouts and cause navigation errors. And they can also damage the systems and electronics on satellites. Astronauts and people at high altitudes are also at risk from exposure to these high-energy particles and radiation, with some interactions leading to increased risks of these people developing cancer. So this is all not great, clearly. But coronal mass ejections is really where the fun begins. This huge magnetic cloud of particles can interact with Earth's magnetic field in such a way that it causes huge disruptions and lead to something that we call a geomagnetic storm. And what's important to know here is that whenever there's a changing magnetic field, an associated electric field is induced. So the magnetic fluctuations can lead to a powerful electrical current being generated at ground level on Earth, which has the ability to overload and possibly destroy transformers, and even overload entire power grids. Now, the largest storm in recorded history was in 1859, and it's called the Carrington event. It had the energy of billions of atomic bombs and caused a massive geomagnetic storm. Northern lights were reported as far south as Cuba, and southern lights were seen as far north as Santiago. And people could actually read their newspapers in the north of US because these aurora were so bright. And the geomagnetic disturbances were so powerful that sparks were actually flying out of telegraph equipment. But that was in 1859, not exactly a time where they were too heavily reliant on electrical technologies. Not compared to today, anyway. Without heavy use and reliance on electronics, can you imagine what would happen if a storm this size or even larger occurred in the modern world? The electrical currents generated at ground level could have the power to overload and destroy transformers and possibly entire power grids in different places around the world, meaning that everything plugged into a wall socket would be disabled. Now, sparks probably wouldn't be flying out of your phone, but as soon as it's out of battery, that's it. With no way to charge it, it's done. And the solar activity would likely damage some satellites, with some being so damaged that they'd probably be beyond repair. And so, GPS systems that are used in things like aeroplanes, cars, and your phones wouldn't work properly, if at all. And without a functioning power grid, the internet would be down. And I wouldn't be able to upload any of these videos for you guys to watch. Transportation systems, water and food distribution, heating and air conditioning, sewage disposal, even things that we take for granted every day like modern banking, wouldn't function. Ultimately, electrical and communication systems could be knocked down, potentially across Earth, for days, months, or even years. technological darkness with only a few hours' notice before it happened. Just think about that for a second. If bank accounts and banking stopped functioning, if the stock exchange went down, and if communication systems went down, even just for one day, the consequences would be terrible. Now, what would happen if it were offline for a year, or even longer? You very quickly get to a point where you realize this could be one of the biggest threats that humanity could face in the modern world. Do you know how to make a fire without using a lighter? Do you know how to treat someone that needs urgent medical attention? Do you know how to find food and fresh water? Now, some of you were probably able to say yes to some or even all of those, but the reality is that the modern world and our modern comforts have meant that a lot of us just simply don't have those skills. But that doesn't matter because this is all hypothetical, right? Well, yep, this is likely a worst case scenario, and it would require conditions to be just right to produce a perfect storm of solar activity. So it's unlikely, but it is still possible. Now, a storm the size of the 1859 Carrington event, which was a huge solar event, would likely not be able to affect the entire globe, but could still do some serious damage around the world, leading to many of those impacts that I've just mentioned. And what might worry you is that it actually almost happened, just a few years ago. Do you remember in 2012 when people were claiming that it was going to be the end of the world that year? Well, yeah, like most people, I didn't believe them, but it turns out that they were almost close to getting it right. On July 23rd, 2012, a giant coronal mass ejection just narrowly missed us. It turned out that it was a massive amount of solar activity, with multiple coronal mass ejections and a giant solar flare. And when I say that it just narrowly missed us, I mean it. If the eruption had occurred just 1 week earlier, Earth would have been in the direct line of fire. So with most of us not knowing anything about it, we managed to just cruise on by and potentially avoid complete catastrophe. But how common are these solar storms? How likely is it that it's going to happen again and we're going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Well, some estimates suggest that we may have a 12% chance of actually being hit by one of these massive storms by 2022. So actually it's kind of possible and kind of likely that it's going to happen pretty soon. Luckily, this is a highly active area of research, and there are a bunch of people and organizations that constantly monitor the sun for this kind of solar activity and these solar eruptions. And in the grand scheme of things, other than detecting it early and preparing as best we can, there really isn't a lot that we could do. So I mean, there's no point in worrying about it. You might as well just go and see a sunrise or go and see a sunset and just try to appreciate the sun's enormous power. I mean, if any of these solar eruptions happen anytime soon, it might be one of the last ones you ever get to see. Hey again guys, so before the sun decides to throw us all back into technological darkness, I like to use my fully charged phone to listen to podcasts, and one of my favourite podcasts is Vsauce 2's The Create Unknown. So I'm really excited to say that they sponsored this episode of Aspect Science. The Create Unknown is hosted by Vsauce 2's Kevin Lieber alongside his co-host Matt Tabor, and they take a look at the lives and the business of a bunch of different content creators. And what I'm really loving about the podcast is being able to discover a bunch of different content creators that I've never really heard of, especially because they've all got really interesting stories and thoughts and perspectives about a range of different topics. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, or if you're just a little bit curious, I highly recommend you check out The Create Unknown. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts, or on your favourite podcast app. And you can even find it on their very own YouTube channel. And I'll put a link to all of these down in the notes so you can find them nice and easy. So that is it for another episode of Aspect Science. So until next time, I'm Tom. You keep discovering the world around you, and I'll see you then.